visibly upset as they walked out of court. Most of them spoke on behalf of Ford, asking the judge for mercy, saying she was a wonderful motherly figure. They were hoping the judge would only...
The murder was torture. The child suffered a slow and agonizing death. The judge's voice fills a quiet Chicago courtroom in 2017. A diary sits in an evidence bag. Its first page is decorated with hearts. Its last entries record hunger, pain, and the child's effort to love the people hurting her. 8-year-old Gizzell Ford will never write again. Her grandmother, Helen Ford, stands at the defense table and says nothing as the sentence is read. She is not a phantom from a campfire story. She is a grandmother on the south side of Chicago, a caretaker in a crowded apartment where neighbors heard little and suspected less. In public, Helen Ford presents as an ordinary matriarch holding a troubled family together. Privately, she starves and beats her granddaughter, tightens ligatures, and controls water like a commodity. The scope is one victim in one home in July 2013, but the documentation is massive. Medical photographs, autopsy reports, and above all, a child's diary. The cruelty is undeniable, and the notoriety comes not from tabloids, but from the awful precision of the record. This is not a case that depends on reconstructed timelines or contested memories. The child herself left testimony in her own handwriting, a chronicle of suffering that prosecutors would later describe as one of the most heartbreaking pieces of evidence they had ever presented to a court. Helen Ford is born in the early 1960s and grows up in Chicago's working-class neighborhoods. Her adult life centers around extended family and a small apartment on the city's south side, where generations overlap in cramped quarters and privacy is a luxury no one can afford. Years later, her adolescent daughter gives birth to Gizzell. When adult instability and illness push the family toward Helen's address, the grandmother becomes the de facto custodian. There are warning signs visible to those who know where to look. School absences accumulate without adequate explanation. A frail child appears at occasional family gatherings, quiet and withdrawn. A Department of Children and Family Services visit. Weeks before the homicide produces paperwork but not protection. None trigger decisive intervention. The path to July 2013 is paved with routine and denial, with assumptions that family care is always preferable to state intervention, with caseworkers stretched too thin to follow every thread. The system sees but does not act with sufficient urgency. The formative moment is not a dramatic explosion. It is slow construction, rules that become restrictions, punishments that become torture, deprivation schedules that transform a home into a prison, a household stripped of mercy one day at a time. The crimes occur over months and culminate in July 2013. The method is not a single blow or a moment of rage. It is a regimen, a systematic campaign of control and cruelty that treats a child as an object to be managed rather than a person to be nurtured. Food and water withheld as discipline, measured, out in portions tied to obedience and withheld for infractions real or imagined, beatings with implements that leave marks in layers, telling the story of abuse, both recent and chronic, binding with cords that cut into small wrists and ankles, leaving ligature marks that the medical examiner will photograph and catalogue, forced standing for hours, a stress position that turns the body into its own instrument of punishment, bathroom bans that turn bodily functions into punishable acts, creating a cycle of humiliation and pain. Gizzell records it in careful handwriting, the penmanship of a child trying to be good, apologies for transgressions she may not have committed, promises to be better, statements of pain written with heartbreaking precision. She writes, "I hate this life." She writes that she is hungry. She writes that she hurts. She writes that she loves her grandmother and wants to make her happy. The pattern escalates as control hardens into torture, as the boundaries of acceptable punishment dissolve entirely. Ligature marks appear and deepen. Weight drops from a frame already too small. The suffering is methodical and relentless, designed to break will and enforce absolute compliance. In the final hours, the child is strangled, and the autopsy confirms fatal asphyxia, complicated by chronic abuse, malnutrition, and dehydration. She cannot avoid capture because she is dead in a room full of evidence. The most horrifying aspect is the diary itself, a child's attempt to please a captor who is also a grandmother, to earn love through suffering, to survive by promising to be better. The pages are evidence of hope dying slowly, one entry at a time. The investigation starts when police respond to the death. Detectives find the diary in the small bedroom where Gizzell spent her final months. They find bruises in multiple stages of healing, a forensic calendar of violence written on a child's skin. They find a bedroom that looks more like a cell, sparse and controlled, a space designed for confinement rather than comfort. The medical examiner catalogues injuries, new and old, mapping the progression of abuse with clinical precision. Prior agency involvement becomes a timeline, not a shield, visits logged, concerns noted, follow-up scheduled but not completed. There is no chase. Helen Ford is arrested in 2013 and charged with first-degree murder. She denies intent. She claims discipline, not cruelty. She invokes stress, poverty, and the challenges of raising a difficult child. The evidence denies her every word. The diary speaks louder than any defense. In 2017, after a bench trial where a judge, rather than a jury, weighs the evidence, the court finds her guilty of first-degree murder of a child. The judge's words are spare and cutting. This murder was torture. The child suffered a slow and agonizing death. The sentence is natural life in the Illinois Department of Corrections with no possibility of parole. There are no mitigating factors sufficient to soften the judgment. There is only the record, a diary, an autopsy, and the absence of mercy. Her fate is sealed. She will die in prison, another name on the roster of the Decatur Correctional Center or whichever facility houses her until her last day. The cultural aftermath is not a movie deal or true crime podcast sensation, but professional reckoning. Conferences where mandated reporters discuss how they missed the danger, policy revisions meant to close the gaps, training sessions where the diary is shown, redacted, anonymized as a warning. Child welfare systems in Illinois and beyond examine what went wrong, how a child could write herself to death, while adults with legal obligations to protect her filed reports and moved on. The diary becomes a training artifact, a warning that paperwork is not protection, a reminder that the most dangerous places for children are sometimes the homes where they are supposed to be safest. Is evil a sudden event or a system? In this apartment, it is a system, rules, schedules, and a child's handwriting trying to survive them. In Montana, another home uses a different system. This one is filmed.
On June 6 and maybe into June 7.
Before grandmother Batts can see trial in front of a jury, the decision on whether capital punishment is on the table must be determined.
The heinous, malevolent. The judge in Bozeman does not reach for poetry. He reaches for accuracy. On February 3rd, 2020, 12-year-old James Alexander, Alex Hurley, is dying on the floor in West Yellowstone, Montana. His grandmother, Patricia Lynn Batts, had called it discipline. The state of Montana calls it homicide. Publicly, Batts is a grieving matriarch whose son died young, leaving her to raise a boy in difficult circumstances. She appears as the anchor in a multi-generational home, the stable adult in a family fractured by loss and addiction. Privately, she presides over a closed world where a boy sleeps little, eats less, and is beaten by family members who record it on their phones as if documenting progress rather than torture. One victim, one house, one winter in a small Montana town where people mind their business and family troubles stay behind closed doors. The notoriety spikes not because of rumor or tabloid coverage, but because the evidence is digital and devastating. The videos are time-stamped, high definition, undeniable. They show what happened and who did it and how often it occurred. They turn a case that might have been he said, she said, into a visual record of abuse that no defense attorney can explain away. Patricia Batts is born in the early 1970s and remains in Montana throughout adulthood, settling in the small tourist town of West Yellowstone. The family's history includes loss that would challenge any household. The boy's father, Batts' son, is dead, the household is unstable, and the discipline ethos hardens into ritualized abuse as stress mounts and support systems fail to materialize. Early warning signs appear on a cell phone screen, episodes of humiliation and striking that are shared within the home, not outside it. The recordings are kept, rewatched, perhaps used as threats or reminders of authority. The path to the crime is a narrowing corridor. Fewer outsiders allowed into the home, more control exerted over the boy's daily life, fewer meals offered without strings attached, more injuries appearing and being explained away. The household becomes a closed ecosystem where the grandmother's word is absolute law and where dissent or disobedience trigger consequences that are both violent and documented. The turning point is a choice to record cruelty, as if the camera validates power, as if documenting abuse somehow makes it legitimate. A coaching technique rather than a crime. The abuse accelerates in late 2019 into early 2020 through a Montana winter where isolation is easy and questions are few. The method is prolonged punishment, masked as training, discipline reimagined as boot camp. Batts directs others, including her husband James Sasser Jr., to hit, restrain, and deprive. The videos recovered by investigators show forced exercises, push-ups and runs, and stress positions designed to exhaust and humiliate. They show kneeling positions held until muscles scream. They show beatings delivered with hands and objects. The boy's face is swollen in successive clips, his eyes hollow, his body thinner with each recording. The pattern is escalation documented in real time, a video diary of cruelty that tracks the progression from harsh punishment to systematic torture. The most disturbing aspect is the performative quality, the instruction, the staging, the sense of a choreography of pain, as if the cruelty is a curriculum and the recordings are lesson plans. He cannot evade capture because the home is the prison and the warden is his grandmother. He cannot run because there is nowhere to go in a small town in winter. He cannot tell because the adults around him are complicit or powerless. The investigation begins with the boy's death on February 3rd, 2020. Deputies respond to a call and find a child who will never wake up. They seize phones and discover the videos. The clips are timestamps and confessions, evidence that requires no interpretation. Autopsy shows blunt force trauma consistent with repeated beatings, internal injuries, and signs of chronic malnutrition and stress. The breakthrough is visual. Police do not need to reconstruct events from conflicting statements. They can watch what happened. Batts is arrested in 2020 along with her husband. The charges are severe: deliberate homicide, aggravated kidnapping, strangulation of a partner or family member, and criminal child endangerment. The evidence is overwhelming and horrifying in equal measure. In 2023, Patricia Lynn Batts pleads guilty to deliberate homicide, along with related abuse counts, as part of an agreement that spares her the possibility of the death penalty, but guarantees she will never leave prison. At sentencing, the judge calls the case a horrific case of child abuse done with malevolence, and notes that the videos show a level of cruelty that defies comprehension. The sentence is life in prison without the possibility of parole, with additional terms for companion crimes running consecutively. Her husband receives a similar sentence in a separate proceeding. Her fate is locked in the Montana Department of Corrections, likely at the Montana Women's Prison in Billings, where she will remain until she dies. The cultural legacy is instructional and grim. Video can be a tool for justice when abusers turn it into a trophy cabinet, when perpetrators document their own crimes with the confidence that comes from believing they will never be held accountable. It also exposes how family groups can normalize violence until a child dies, how multiple adults can participate in or witness abuse without anyone breaking the silence. The case becomes a training scenario for law enforcement on digital evidence and family dynamics. It becomes a cautionary tale about the dangers of closed homes and the importance of looking beyond what families present to the outside world. What turns grief into ritual torture? In this house, a death in the prior generation becomes fuel for cruelty to the next, as if the boy must pay for the loss of his father, as if suffering can be transferred from one person to another. In Canada, there is no video. There is a scale, a locked door, and a number no 5-year-old should ever weigh.
The woman at the other end said she had a problem.
And what's the problem?
The grandson's not breathing right now.
Or worse than an animal. That phrase appears over and over in Canadian coverage of the death of 5-year-old Jeffrey Baldwin. It is not metaphor or hyperbole. It is a factual description of conditions documented by police, social workers, and medical examiners. In a Toronto home in 2002, grandparents Elva Bottineau and Norman Kidman feed 2 small children from a bucket. They keep them in an unheated room through a Canadian winter. When Jeffrey dies on November 30th, 2002, he weighs 21 pounds. What a healthy toddler weighs, not a kindergartner. The number is so shocking that investigators initially question whether the scale is broken. Publicly, Bottineau and Kidman are caregivers entrusted by the state, kinship providers stepping up when biological parents cannot or will not. Privately, they are repeat abusers who hide children in a locked room and starve them while feeding their own children and themselves at a separate table. Their case is notorious because the system handed them custody despite a prior abuse history, despite red flags in the file, despite warnings that should have been heeded. The scope is one confirmed fatality and another child survivor in the same room. Jeffrey's older sister, who lived through the same conditions and will carry the scars, physical and psychological, for the rest of her life. The notoriety comes from the institutional failure as much as the crime itself, from the realization that systems designed to protect children can sometimes deliver them into the hands of their killers. Elva Bottineau and Norman Kidman are middle-aged Torontonians with documented pasts in child welfare files that stretch back years. Decades earlier, reports flagged dangerous conditions in their home, noted concerns about other children in their care, recommended restrictions or supervision. In 2000, they still received custody of Jeffrey and his sister when their daughter, Bottineau's daughter, is deemed unfit to parent. Early warning signs are structural rather than individual. School does not call because Jeffrey hardly attends. He is kept out of sight, isolated from teachers who might notice his condition. Social workers do not visit enough, and when they do, they see what the grandparents want them to see. A tidy living room, a polite greeting, assurances that all is well. The path to homicide is administrative, forms filled out, approvals granted, and assumptions about kinship care that privilege family placement over child safety. The key moment is placement itself, an institutional choice that trumps common sense and the documented history of the caregivers. The system prioritizes keeping children within the family, even when the family has already proven dangerous. The crimes run from 2000 to November 2002, encompassing more than 2 years of systematic neglect and abuse. The pattern is deprivation pursued with chilling consistency. The children are confined to a small room in the basement, unheated even in the depths of a Toronto winter when temperatures plunge below freezing. They are fed meager scraps from a bucket, food mixed together and often spoiled, portions insufficient to sustain a growing child. They are forced to eat from the floor when they spill or displease their captors. Jeffrey's weight falls month by month, pound by pound, his body consuming itself to stay alive. He develops infections that go untreated. His hair thins and falls out in patches. He becomes lethargic, unable to play or engage. He is invisible to the world outside the locked door. The suffering is slow and methodical, a daily erosion of health and hope. Evading capture is easy because the door stays shut and the children stay silent and the system does not look closely enough. The most disturbing fact at autopsy is his weight, 21 pounds, with pneumonia, sepsis, and signs of chronic neglect so severe that the pathologist will later testify he had never seen a case of starvation this extreme in a Canadian child. The body tells a story of months of suffering, of hunger that never ended, of cold that never warmed. The investigation begins when the caregivers finally call for help. Too late, when Jeffrey is already beyond saving. The coroner reads the body like a ledger, documenting each sign of neglect, the weight, the infections, the evidence of long-term malnutrition, the lack of subcutaneous fat, the muscle wasting. Police inventory the room, the bucket, the locks on the door that kept the children trapped. Witnesses, neighbors who heard little, relatives who visited rarely, describe a household where some children were treated well and others were hidden. They describe food as a reward, withheld more often than given, punishment that seemed designed to break rather than correct. Arrests follow in 2002, and the charges reflect the severity of the crime. Second-degree murder for both Bottineau and Kidman. In 2006, after a trial that lays bare the full scope of the abuse, a jury convicts both grandparents of second-degree murder. The judge imposes life sentences with parole ineligibility periods appropriate to Canadian law. Bottineau receives a minimum of 20 years before parole eligibility. Kidman receives 22 years. There is no theatrics in the courtroom, no dramatic speeches. There is a ledger of pain and a judgment that reflects the deliberate nature of the cruelty. The verdicts are unanimous, the sentences are severe, they remain incarcerated in separate federal institutions in Canada. As of 2025, both have served more than 2 decades behind bars. The lasting impact is reform that extends far beyond this single case. Ontario's child welfare authorities overhaul how they vet kinship placements, instituting more rigorous background checks that cross-reference old abuse histories even when they occurred years or decades earlier. They mandate more frequent home visits and more thorough inspections, especially in cases where children are isolated from school and community. They train workers to recognize the signs of hidden abuse, to look beyond the public face of a family. Jeffrey's name becomes shorthand for a policy failure as much as a crime, a reminder that the system meant to protect children can sometimes deliver them into danger. His case is studied in social work programs, cited in legislative debates, invoked whenever the question arises of how to balance family preservation with child safety. Is starvation less violent because it is slow? The answer sits in a small coffin, in the autopsy photos that jurors wept over, in the weight that no 5-year-old should register. In Oklahoma City, the violence is not slow. It is theatrical, and the costume has a name.
Her young life.
Court records say Robinson used a pink dog leash to hang the little girl by her arms in the garage.
No child does.
She said the witch was going to eat me. The child's words arrive in a hospital triage room in Oklahoma City, spoken to a nurse who immediately recognizes them as more than fantasy. The nurse calls authorities. In a small house on the city's south side, investigators find paraphernalia that turns a child's nightmare into evidence. A witch mask with green makeup still smeared on the rubber, a child's leash attached to a collar, and a closet where a girl says she was suspended and beaten. The grandmother's name is Geneva S. Robinson, but inside the house she calls herself Nelda the Witch, a character she created to terrorize children into obedience. Publicly, Robinson is a church-going grandmother caring for multiple children, a pillar of her small community, a woman who volunteers and smiles and presents as a model of family values. Privately, she weaponizes fantasy, turning fairy tale fears into instruments of control and punishment. There is one central victim, a little girl whose name is withheld from public records to protect her privacy, but there are other children who witness the terror, who hear the threats, who learn that love and fear can exist in the same house. The case becomes famous because the cruelty is both physical and psychological, staged with a persona and repeated threats that blur the line between discipline and abuse, between authority and sadism. Geneva Robinson is born in the mid-1960s in Oklahoma. Growing up in a culture where corporal punishment is normalized and where religious faith and strict discipline often intertwine. By the 2010s, she lives with grandchildren after family upheaval, parents struggling with addiction or incarceration, or simply the inability to care for their own children. The stresses are real. Poverty, overcrowding, the challenge of raising young children at an age when most grandparents expect leisure. So is the intent to dominate. Early signals appear when neighbors hear screams that go on too long, when children flinch at loud noises, when a little girl at a store clings to a stranger and whispers that she does not want to go home. Robinson calls the character Nelda, claiming the witch will eat misbehaving children, will take them away in the night, will do things worse than any human punishment. The path to the crimes is rehearsal, practicing the makeup, refining the voice, collecting the props, the mask, the costume, the implements of punishment. The turning point comes when injury makes secrecy impossible, when a child's wounds are severe enough that even emergency room doctors who see abuse weekly are shocked by what they find. The crimes center on the 2014-2015 period, though investigators suspect the pattern goes back further. The method includes beatings with hands and objects, food deprivation used as punishment, and suspension by a leash attached to a collar, leaving the child dangling and struggling to breathe. The pattern is performative terror, changing into makeup and costume to heighten fear before administering punishment, threatening the arrival of creatures that will harm disobedient children, and building rituals around punishment that make it theatrical rather than merely brutal. The most disturbing detail is the scripted nature of the abuse. Costume changes as prelude to pain, a performance designed to maximize psychological trauma alongside physical injury. Evasion ends when the child's injuries require medical care that cannot be provided at home, when the wounds are too severe to hide, when a mandatory reporter sees what has been done and makes the call that starts the investigation. The investigation opens at a hospital where doctors document injuries consistent with prolonged abuse, bruises in multiple stages of healing, ligature marks, signs of malnutrition, and psychological trauma that manifests in the child's terror of certain colors and sounds. Detectives serve warrants and search the home. They find cell phone images showing the child in stress positions. They find physical implements, the leash, the mask, the whooping sticks used to beat. They find statements from other children who describe the witch game and the punishments that followed. Robinson is arrested in 2014, along with her partner Joshua Groves, who participated in some of the abuse. The charges are extensive, multiple felony counts of child abuse and child neglect. In 2017, after legal proceedings that include competency evaluations and plea negotiations, Robinson pleads guilty to multiple felony counts of child abuse and neglect. The court imposes 3 life sentences to run concurrently, along with additional time for related charges. At sentencing, the prosecutor tells the judge, she deserves the same amount of mercy she showed this child, and that's none. The judge agrees, noting that the defendant used her position of trust and authority to inflict sustained terror on a vulnerable child. There is no possibility of parole in the foreseeable future. Robinson remains in the Oklahoma prison system, housed at Mabel Bassett Correctional Center, or another facility within the state's women's prison network. The cultural residue is a cautionary lesson for clinicians and educators. When a child uses fantasy language to describe harm, witches, monsters, creatures, listen to the facts embedded in the fear. Children often lack the vocabulary to describe abuse in adult terms, so they use the language of stories. The witch was real. The torture was real. The child's fear was absolutely justified. Do monsters need masks? Sometimes they do. Sometimes they smile, put the body in a trash can, and try to carry on with the party.
First witness called to the stand was actually a former tenant in Vreeland's house, then Vreeland's ex-husband Lyle, and an Oklahoma City police lieutenant and a detective.
The Oklahoma City dispatcher hears the words no first responder forgets. We found her in the trash can. 3-year-old Riley Lynn Nolan does not answer when paramedics arrive. Her grandmother, Becky Vreeland, has already decided the day's celebration must continue. The child's head has suffered multiple blows, fractures that the medical examiner will describe as catastrophic. The weapon of choice is discipline renamed tradition, a whooping stick kept handy for enforcing obedience. Publicly, Vreeland is the matriarch of a multi-generational household, the stable center in a family where younger adults struggle with jobs, relationships, and the demands of parenthood. Privately, she is the enforcer, the one who sets the rules and administers the punishments, the one whose word is law and whose anger is to be feared. One child, one yard, one trash can behind a modest house in Oklahoma City. It is not the body's location that haunts officers. They have seen bodies in worse places. It is the calculated delay, the decision to conceal rather than call for help, the choice to prioritize a social gathering over a dying child. In 2022, the crime ends a life. In 2024, the sentence formalizes what the evidence said all along. This was murder, not discipline gone wrong. Becky Vreeland is born in the early 1960s. She grows up in Oklahoma and remains tethered to extended family, settling in Oklahoma City, where family bonds are strong and where discipline is a value passed down through generations, sometimes crossing the line from correction to cruelty. Early signs are small and easy to miss. Bruises explained away as the normal bumps and scrapes of active children, children who are quiet at dinner, who avoid eye contact, who flinch when adults raise their voices, a stick leaning behind a door, ready for use, a culture of punishment that views pain as pedagogy. The path to homicide is short but steep. Stress builds, financial pressure, family drama, the exhaustion of caring for young children. Impulse meets a weapon already in the room. The key moment is not the blow itself, but the choice that follows. Not to call 911, not to rush the child to a hospital, but to hide the body and hope no one notices until the party is over. The crime occurs in 2022, on a day when Vreeland is preparing to host a gathering. The method is blunt force trauma to a toddler's school, delivered with sufficient force to fracture bone. The autopsy will report 3 separate skull fractures, along with brain injury and internal bleeding. The pattern is intermittent beatings that escalate to a fatal episode, a trajectory seen in many child abuse homicides where control slowly erodes and violence intensifies. Evasion lasts as long as denial can last, as long as a body can be hidden in a backyard trash can while guests arrive and music plays and food is served. Vreeland hides the body to avoid disrupting her plans, to prevent the questions and the ambulances and the police cars that would ruin the day she had prepared. The most horrifying aspect is the priority, a celebration over a child's life, a party over a granddaughter's suffering. The investigation begins with a 911 call that comes too late, placed only after the gathering ends and the deception can no longer hold. Detectives find blood evidence in the home, spatter patterns that tell the story of violence in a specific location. The medical examiner documents cranial fractures and other trauma, injuries that could not possibly be accidental. Witness statements from other children describe a whooping stick used often, describe Riley being hit for minor infractions, describe fear that permeated the household. Forensic analysis of the timeline reveals the delay between death and the call for help, the hours when Riley lay in a trash can while adults socialized nearby. Vreeland is arrested and charged with first-degree murder, child abuse, a charge that reflects both the killing and the context of ongoing cruelty. In October 2024, Becky Vreeland pleads no contest to child abuse murder, a plea that allows her to avoid a trial while not admitting guilt but accepting that the evidence would likely lead to conviction. She receives a life sentence, and under Oklahoma law, she must serve at least 85% of the term before parole consideration, effectively ensuring she will spend the rest of her life behind bars. There are no dramatic courtroom speeches, no tearful apologies, no explanations that satisfy. There is a sentence and a record and a small coffin. She is in state custody, likely at Mabel Bassett Correctional Center, where she joins other women convicted of crimes against children. The case circulates in training materials for child fatality review teams, used to illustrate how concealment is itself an element of the crime, how the actions taken after a child is injured can be as telling as the injury itself. The decision to hide rather than help, to preserve normalcy rather than seek emergency care, speaks to consciousness of guilt and to a value system where appearances matter more than a child's life. What does a household teach? Children learn what matters by what adults save. Here, the party mattered more than Riley. The celebration mattered more than a call to 911. In North Carolina, the lesson is older, a caretaker who confuses authority for impunity.
Ricks is charged with murder after the severely injured child was pronounced dead at a hospital in Nash County on Tuesday. Sheriff's officials say social services had been investigating Ricks.
A local anchor in Nash County reads the headline that will define a family forever. A grandmother sentenced to life in prison for the murder of her 8-year-old granddaughter. The defendant's name is Patricia Ann Ricks. The child's name is held by grieving relatives who carry it to every hearing, who speak it in victim impact statements, who refuse to let her be reduced to a case number. Publicly, Ricks is a grandmother who stepped in when a family fractured, who took on the responsibility of raising a child when the biological parents could not or would not. Privately, investigators say she became a captor who punished, humiliated, and finally killed. One victim, one county, one life sentence handed down in 2025. The notoriety is regional, but the pattern is familiar. Escalating injuries noticed, but not reported. A small circle of adults who see but do not intervene. A child running out of chances as the violence intensifies. Patricia Ann Ricks is born in the early 1960s. She lives in North Carolina and becomes a guardian after parental instability, addiction, incarceration, mental illness, the myriad ways adults fail children. Warning signs include unexplained injuries that appear when the child visits relatives or goes to school, bruises on the arms, marks on the legs, a withdrawn demeanor that worries teachers but not enough to file a report. The home grows more closed as time passes, visitors less frequent, outside contact more controlled. The path to homicide includes stress that accumulates without outlet, anger that grows without check, and a culture of punishment that does not recognize limits or boundaries. The turning point is the fatal night when injuries go beyond what a body can survive, when punishment becomes homicide. The crimes take shape over 2022 and into 2023. A period of escalating abuse that leaves physical evidence on the child's body and psychological scars on witnesses who will later describe what they saw and failed to stop. The method is cumulative, beatings that increase in frequency and severity, deprivation of food and comfort, and a final assault that produces fatal trauma documented in detail by the medical examiner. The pattern is control and secrecy. A closed household where the grandmother's word is law, and where the child has no advocate, no escape route, no safe adult to turn to. The most disturbing aspect is how long it takes for outsiders to understand what is happening in a child's home, how many times the warning signs appear and are dismissed or rationalized. The investigation begins with the child's death, a call to emergency services that arrives when there is nothing left to do but document and prosecute. Detectives reconstruct injuries through autopsy and witness statements, mapping bruises in different stages of healing to create a timeline of abuse. They map the progression from discipline to violence to homicide. They find implements used to strike the child. They establish a timeline that shows escalation, shows opportunities missed, shows a child who died by degrees. Ricks is arrested in 2023 and charged with murder and felony child abuse, charges that carry the possibility of life in prison. In 2025, after a trial that presents medical evidence, witness testimony, and forensic analysis, a North Carolina jury convicts her of first-degree murder. The judge imposes life in prison without the possibility of parole. There is no doubt left for the record. The child did not die by accident, did not die from illness, died because the person charged with her care chose violence over protection. Ricks is serving a life term without parole eligibility at the North Carolina Correctional Institution for Women or another facility within the state prison system. The case draws wider attention only because it repeats a script that the public says it will never tolerate and yet keeps missing: a vulnerable child, a trusted caretaker, escalating violence, and a system that does not intervene until it is too late. What closes a door? Sometimes fear, sometimes habit, sometimes the belief that family is always safe, that blood relations guarantee protection. Across the Atlantic, a camera sees everything and proves otherwise.
How do you feel about that now?
Disgusting himself.
Michael Ives later told police he regretted the way he carried his grandson, but offered no explanation for
The CCTV has no motive, it has no emotions. It records what it sees in a house on Garden City, Deeside, Flintshire, Wales, in the summer of 2021. A toddler's body goes limp in adult hands, shaken and struck and handled with a roughness that defies comprehension. Later there will be more footage, hours of it, and autopsy photographs showing more than 40 injuries on a body that should have been cherished and protected. The boy's name is Ethan Ives Griffiths. His grandparents, Michael and Kerry Ives, will stand trial for his murder. Publicly, Michael and Kerry present as a couple stepping up when their daughter cannot cope, offering stability and care in a chaotic situation. Privately, they starve, dehydrate, and batter a 2-year-old over weeks until his head injury becomes catastrophic and his small body shuts down. The scope is one victim, one house, and a trial in 2025 that sets minimum terms of 23 years for Michael and 17 years for Kerry. The case is notorious in Wales because it is proven on tape, because the evidence is visual and undeniable, because the jury can watch exactly what happened and exactly who did it. Michael Ives is born in the late 1970s, Kerry in the late 1970s or early 1980s. They live in Deeside, a town in North Wales, and present as a stable couple willing to care for their grandson. In June 2021, Ethan moves into their home after concerns about his mother's ability to parent. Warning signs arrive almost immediately: weight loss that is dramatic and rapid, bruises that appear and multiply, lethargy and withdrawal that worry anyone who sees the boy. The path is direct and documented. CCTV installed in the home, ostensibly for security, captures rough handling that escalates to violent shaking and impacts. The turning point is the head injury that the adults do not promptly report, the injury that will kill Ethan and that the footage will show being inflicted. The crimes occur between June and August 2021, a 10-week period during which Ethan is systematically abused. The method is a mixture of neglect and active violence, a combination that is especially lethal in young children. Food is withheld or provided in portions insufficient for a growing toddler. Liquids are limited, leading to dehydration. Stress positions appear in footage. The child forced to stand or kneel for extended periods. The pattern is daily cruelty punctuated by severe assaults, routine deprivation interrupted by explosive violence. The most horrifying detail is the ragdoll handling caught on camera, the child's head snapping back as he is shaken, his limbs dangling limp, an adult's hand gripping his shoulders like he is a toy rather than a human being. The footage shows Ethan being thrown, struck, and manhandled with a casual cruelty that suggests the behavior is normalized, routine, unremarkable to the perpetrators. The investigation starts with a delayed emergency call when Ethan collapses on August 8, 2021, and cannot be revived. Hospital staff see injuries inconsistent with a fall or accident, too many, too patterned, too severe. Police secure the house and the digital video recorder. Forensic specialists recover CCTV clips that show the full scope of the abuse. There is no evasion once the footage plays, no alternative explanation that fits the facts. The Ives are arrested and charged with murder and multiple counts of child cruelty. In 2025, after a 6-week trial at Mold Crown Court, a jury convicts both Michael and Kerry Ives of murder. The judge's sentencing remarks detail a pattern of sustained abuse and its fatal result, noting the vulnerability of the victim and the breach of trust inherent in the crimes. Sentences are life terms with minimum terms before parole eligibility, 23 years for Michael, 17 for Kerry. Ethan's mother, Katie Marie Ives Griffiths, is also convicted of causing or allowing his death and child cruelty and receives a 10-year prison term. They are in prison in Wales, held in separate facilities within His Majesty's prison service. As of 2025, they have decades to serve before even the possibility of release. The case triggers a safeguarding review that examines how Ethan came to be placed with grandparents despite warning signs, how agencies track rapidly changing custodial arrangements in fragile families, and how technology, CCTV installed for one purpose, can become evidence of crimes the installers never anticipated. Is neglect less visible than violence? Not here. The camera saw both, recorded both, preserved both for a jury that had to watch a child die in slow motion, frame by frame. Far away in New Zealand, there is no camera, only a phone call and a confession.
Ms. Smith has devoted her life to caring for her family, to the detriment of her own health and welfare. The burden of doing so has taken a tremendous toll.
I've killed my granddaughter. The 111 call in Wanganui, New Zealand is flat, as if disbelief has burned out every other emotion. The caller is Lorraine Smith. The victim is 13-year-old Kaylis Smith. The date is 2019. New Zealand police will not have to find a suspect. She is waiting at the door when they arrive, ready to confess, ready to accept responsibility for what she has done. Publicly, Smith is a caregiver grandmother, carrying a heavy load in a small home, tending to a child with special needs that would challenge any adult. Kaylis has fetal alcohol spectrum disorder and other conditions that make caregiving difficult, that require patience and resources and support that are often in short supply. Privately, she is a woman who will snap one night and tighten a necktie around a girl's throat after an argument, who will kill in a moment of rage and then call authorities to report what she has done. One victim, one house, one confession. The public attention is not tabloid fury, but a national debate. How should the law weigh carer burnout against a murdered child? Can context mitigate homicide? Lorraine Smith is born around 1960. She becomes the primary caregiver for Kaylis after the girl's parents prove unable to meet her needs. The day-to-day work is hard and isolating, managing behaviors, administering medications, navigating a system that provides minimal support for grandparents raising grandchildren with disabilities. Warning signs include mounting stress visible to those who know Smith, exhaustion that accumulates without relief, and the absence of outside supports. No respite care, no family help, no professional intervention to ease the burden. The path to homicide is not a campaign of sadism or a pattern of escalating abuse. It is a single, catastrophic act that occurs when stress and anger overwhelm judgment and restraint. The formative moment is the argument that ends with a tie, a struggle, and a death. A moment that changes everything and can never be undone. The crime is fast. The method is strangulation with a necktie, manual compression of the neck until breathing stops and the heart ceases. There is no pattern over years. There is an argument on a single night, a fatal decision made in anger, and a phone call that brings police. The most disturbing aspect is the speed with which a family can cross from frustration to homicide, how quickly the line between discipline and murder can be crossed, how a caregiver can become a killer in minutes. The investigation is straightforward. Smith admits what she did, provides a statement that is detailed and incriminating, does not attempt to evade responsibility. Forensics confirm ligature strangulation as the cause of death. There is no evasion, no alternative theory, no question about what happened or who did it. In 2019, Lorraine Smith pleads guilty to murder in the High Court of New Zealand. The High Court at Wanganui imposes a sentence of 12 years imprisonment, with parole eligibility after 6 years, unusually low for murder in New Zealand, a sentence justified by the court's assessment of context, the defendant's genuine remorse, and the absence of premeditation. The judge notes that Smith was a caregiver under extreme stress, that she called police immediately, that she accepted full responsibility, and that the crime was a single terrible act rather than part of a pattern of abuse. The sentence is controversial. Victim advocates argue it is too lenient. Others say it reflects the reality that not all murders are equivalent, that context matters, that justice must balance punishment with understanding. She serves her time in the Arahata Women's Prison near Wellington, or another facility in the New Zealand prison system. The legacy is a national conversation about mercy, standards, and how systems support or fail overloaded caregivers, especially grandparents raising grandchildren with complex needs. The case prompts calls for better respite care, more mental health support for caregivers, and recognition that family care, while often the best option, requires investment and support to be sustainable. Is motive a measuring stick for harm? It may explain, it cannot excuse, it can contextualize but cannot erase. Back in Alabama, motive wears a crisp label, discipline, and it goes on for hours.
The 4 possible charges, Gerard's attorneys were pushing for criminal negligence resulting in a homicide, which is a misdemeanor. A few members of Gerard's family burst into tears, sobbing.
Drill sergeant from hell. That is how an Alabama prosecutor describes Joyce Harden Garrard in 2015 during jury selection for a capital murder trial. Jury selection has heard about a 9-year-old girl named Savannah Harden forced to run for hours as punishment for a lie about candy. For neighbors who will testify, the most haunting detail will always be the command shouted across a yard, "I didn't tell you to stop." Publicly, Garrard is a grandmother who prizes obedience and structure, who believes in discipline and consequences, who sees herself as preparing children for a world that will not tolerate weakness or dishonesty. Privately, she enforces it with endurance drills that are lethal, with punishment that crosses every line from correction to torture. One victim, one February day in 2012 in Etowah County, Alabama. The notoriety spreads because the evidence includes witnesses who watched a child run and a child collapse, who heard the commands and saw the consequences, who will carry the memory of what they witnessed for the rest of their lives. Joyce Harden Garrard is born around 1965. She grows up in Alabama and becomes the matriarch of a home that values toughness, resilience, and unquestioning obedience. Early warning signs are normalized in a culture where corporal punishment is standard. Strict rules enforced with physical consequences, physical punishment that is harsh but not obviously criminal, fitness used as penance for infractions. The path to homicide is a slope, not a cliff, a gradual escalation from harsh to cruel to deadly. The formative moment is the decision to escalate punishment into hours-long forced running while carrying sticks. In weather and for duration, no child can survive, in response to a minor transgression that any reasonable adult would address with a conversation or a brief timeout. The crime unfolds on a single day in February 2012. Savannah has told a lie about eating candy. As punishment, Garrard orders her to run, carrying sticks around the yard. The method is coerced exertion designed to break will, to instill obedience through suffering. The girl runs for hours. She begs to stop. She is told to continue. Neighbors watch. A school bus driver sees. No one intervenes. The autopsy will trace the cascade. Extreme physical stress leading to dehydration. Dehydration leading to seizure. Seizure leading to multi-organ failure. The pattern, neighbors will later say, is command and refusal of mercy, orders given, and enforcement that does not recognize human limits. The most disturbing aspect is the transformation of caregiving into drill instruction, the belief that a child's suffering is pedagogically useful, that breaking a child's body will somehow improve her character. The investigation begins with an ambulance call and a child who never wakes up, who arrives at the hospital in cardiac arrest and cannot be revived. Witnesses come forward quickly. Neighbors who watched from windows, a school bus driver, who saw the girl running and crying. Medical evidence ties the death to exertion and dehydration. Garrard is arrested in 2012 and charged with capital murder because the victim is under 14 and the death results from torture or abuse, a charge that carries the possibility of the death penalty in Alabama. In 2015, after a trial that includes testimony from medical experts, neighbors, and family members, a jury convicts her of capital murder. The jury then deliberates on sentencing and recommends life without parole by a vote of 7-5, a recommendation that is not unanimous but is followed by the judge. The judge imposes life without the possibility of parole, finding that the crime meets the statutory requirements for capital murder but accepting the jury's recommendation against death. Garrard enters Alabama's Julia Tutwiler Prison for Women, the state's primary women's correctional facility. On February 12, 2016, less than a year into her sentence, she dies in state custody, 5 days after suffering a heart attack. She is 61 years old. She is gone. The lesson remains. Discipline is not a defense when it becomes torture. Punishment is not legitimate when it kills. The case is cited in debates about corporal punishment, about the line between discipline and abuse, about cultural practices that normalize violence against children. It becomes a training scenario for teachers and school personnel on mandatory reporting, on recognizing when punishment has crossed into abuse, on the obligation to intervene even when, especially when, the perpetrator is a family member in a community that values privacy. Who defines too far when the authority figure controls the stopwatch, decides when the punishment has achieved its goal, holds the power to stop or continue? In mid-century America, one grandmother did not need distance or drills. She used a teaspoon, a bottle of prune juice, and a smile that charmed reporters even as toxicology reports revealed the truth.
Nanny Doss, how many girls are in the women's side at the Oklahoma State Penitentiary?
They called her the giggling granny. Reporters leaned toward Nanny Doss in black and white footage as she laughed and answered questions about husbands who died too soon, too suddenly, too conveniently. The charm worked on the public for a minute, this plump, middle-aged woman with a flower in her hair who seemed more like everybody's grandmother than a serial poisoner. It never worked on toxicology. Nanny Doss, born Nancy Hazel on November 4, 1905 in Blue Mountain, Alabama, grows up under a controlling father who forbids normal childhood activities and dominates his family with rigid rules. She endures a head injury as a child, the result of a train accident, and some later analysts will speculate whether brain damage played a role in her later crimes, though this remains unproven. She escapes into romance magazines and Lonely Hearts columns, seeking the perfect love she reads about in Pulp Fiction. The red thread running through her life is fantasy. Perfect love, perfect home, perfect husband. When reality fails to match the dream, she reaches for rat poison. The early warning signs appear in the 1920s as relatives die under suspicious circumstances. A sister here, a mother-in-law there. Deaths attributed to illness or accident but never investigated deeply enough. The path is a carousel of marriages and insurance policies, husbands acquired and discarded, families depleted one member at a time. The key moment is the autopsy on husband Samuel Doss in 1954, when a doctor who does not like the speed of his decline orders tests that reveal massive arsenic poisoning. Her crimes span roughly from the 1920s to 1954, a 30-year murder spree that crosses state lines and victim categories. The confirmed and admitted victims are at least 11 and include multiple husbands: Charlie Braggs, Frank Harrelson, Arlie Lanning, Richard Morton, and Samuel Doss, along with in-laws, her mother, her sister Dovie, and 2 of her own grandsons. Some estimates place the true victim count higher, as Doss's own children died young under suspicious circumstances that were never fully investigated. The method is poison, arsenic from rat poison, delivered in food and drink, mixed into coffee or cake or stewed prunes. The pattern is transactional and chillingly consistent. Marry a man or move in with a relative, take out an insurance policy or position yourself as heir, add rat poison to meals over days or weeks, show up at the funeral in black and collect the payout. She evades capture for decades by picking victims whose deaths can be coded as illness or misfortune, by moving frequently, by targeting people whose sudden decline might be attributed to heart attacks or gastric distress rather than homicide. The most disturbing feature is the proximity and the performance. She kills people who kiss her on the cheek, who trust her to cook their meals, who call her mother or grandmother or wife. She cries at their funerals. She cashes their insurance checks. The investigation that ends the spree begins with a doctor in Tulsa, Oklahoma, who does not like the speed of Samuel Doss's decline in October 1954. Samuel falls ill after eating prune cake. He dies within days. The doctor orders an autopsy despite the family's objections. Arsenic lights up the lab reports. Massive quantities, enough to kill several men. Police begin exhuming bodies. They dig up Richard Morton, Arlie Lanning, her mother. The arsenic count rises. Under interrogation, Nanny Doss does something unexpected. She laughs. She confesses to a string of murders, including the deaths of 2 of her grandsons, and she does it with a smile. The newspapers take the bait, printing photos of her grinning with a flower in her hair, calling her the giggling granny and the jolly widow. The coverage is sensational and sexist, treating her as a curiosity rather than a serial killer, but the facts are undeniable. In 1955, Nanny Doss pleads guilty to murdering Samuel Doss in Oklahoma and receives a life sentence. Because she is a woman, prosecutors do not seek the death penalty, reflecting the gender bias of the era that assumed women were less culpable or less dangerous than male killers. She is never tried for all the deaths, but her own admissions in interviews with police and journalists anchor the count in the public record. She serves her time in the Oklahoma State Penitentiary's hospital ward, where her health declines. She dies of leukemia on June 2, 1965, at the age of 59. She remains an icon of a different kind of grandmotherly horror, the opposite of the blunt force and starvation cases that dominate contemporary true crime. No shouting, no cameras, no locked rooms, just chemistry, insurance policies, and a smile that never quite reached her eyes. Her case is studied in criminal psychology courses as an example of a female serial killer, a category that is statistically rare and that operates differently from the male-dominated field, where male serial killers often seek sexual gratification or power through physical domination. Nanny Doss killed for financial gain and to escape relationships that disappointed her, using poison, a method that is historically associated with female killers because it requires proximity and patience rather than physical strength. What produces a killer who bakes arsenic into pie while humming in the kitchen, who serves poisoned coffee with a smile? We can argue nature and nurture, childhood trauma and brain injury, cultural expectations, and limited options for women in mid-century America who wanted to escape bad marriages. The graves do not argue. The names are fixed in cemetery records and death certificates. The dates do not move. The arsenic residue in exhumed remains is a fact that transcends interpretation. A child's diary, a cache of phone videos, a locked room, a witch's mask, a backyard trash can, a North Carolina autopsy, a Welsh CCTV file, a New Zealand guilty plea, an Alabama drill, an Oklahoma confession, and a bottle of rat poison. Different methods, same betrayal. The story you have watched is not a chronology of monsters lurking in shadows. It is a map of ordinary spaces turned lethal by the people children are taught to trust first. Across these 10 cases, we saw sadism that enjoyed pain for its own sake and discipline that rationalized cruelty as correction. We saw systems fail, agencies that did not read old files or cross-check histories, neighbors who heard screams but did not call police, clinicians who saw bruises but accepted explanations, courts that had to reconstruct what adults worked hard to hide. We also saw the investigative tools that work when they are deployed. Diaries kept by brave children who documented their own suffering, coroners who know what bodies say when they are read carefully, patrol officers who listen to what children tell them, prosecutors who build careful cases from fragments of evidence, and judges who speak for the voiceless when they impose sentences. If you live near children and something seems wrong, make the call. You might be wrong, you might be right. The cost of being wrong is embarrassment. The cost of being right and staying silent is a child's life. Evil wears family clothes more often than we want to admit. It lives in ordinary houses on ordinary streets. It hides behind titles like grandmother and caretaker and family. If this exploration helped you understand how abuse hides and how it is exposed, how patterns can be recognized and intervention can save lives, subscribe for more rigorously sourced true crime investigations that prioritize facts over sensationalism and victims over villains. Which case disturbed you most, and why? Your answer might help prevent the next obituary, might help you recognize warning signs, might help you understand that protection is everyone's responsibility. Leave your thoughts in the comments below.